Final ending of No Way, Part 1 down below. I still got up in the morning and went out on the boat to begin my workdays. I deliberately decided to spend money on a few things. A Zippo lighter was the first, and a chimney was the second. A chimney is a transportable ceramic fireplace with a powerful heat source. I would light a fire in the chimney and go find and winch in the first log of the day before heading out on the boat. Then, until I warmed up enough to venture outside once more, I would take a vacation from the bone-chilling cold. Usually, the sun would warm the water by mid-morning, allowing me to avoid wrapping my arms around the chimney. Gail mocked my need for breaks, which I anticipated would happen, blaming them primarily on sloth. I retorted that she had a lot of thoughts that no one seemed to care about for a woman who only wore Texas and MT shirts. She started gasping in response to the comment, started crying, and hurried to get Robert's car, leaving him stuck with me for the day. As we headed to get another wood, I informed Robert that I didn't think it was all that much of an insult. The sawmill was operational by this point, and Gail and Robert had employed a few men to operate it. Though it remained unsaid, I was aware that Gail was pressuring Robert to sever our relationship and bring in a boat crew to run the vessel instead. Robert deserves praise for not giving in to Gail. Now, the only occasions I really saw Gail were when the three of us would go boating to explore a new region. I'm not sure how she did it, but Gail's investigation would consistently find us a fresh cache of logs to cut. Her latest grievance was that my laziness was making it take longer to get logs to the mill. Robert noted that I usually kept ahead of the sawmill workers and that I had accumulated a modest surplus of logs that they needed to handle. Thank heaven for that, since I was afraid she would lose it when I left for the visitation on Saturday. Darn it, I squander a day. I made the point that since the sawmill crew didn't work on weekends, taking a personal day wouldn't negatively impact the operation. Thus, I passed another depressing and solitary hour, shifting my gaze between the door and the clock, anticipating a visit that would never come. Robert had advised me to keep pushing for the kids to come to the visitation. I made it clear that forcing them to do something they both disliked in an attempt to demonstrate my love would only lead to further issues. No, I prefer that they attend voluntarily. I unloaded a log haul late that afternoon and 3 hauls for Sunday, if Gail had cared to notice when I returned from squandering a half day on Saturday. As I continued to worry about Stephen and Carol, the work remained a comfort to my heart. Strangely, I had a startling lack of empathy for Stella. I knew there would be no recovery there because she had so deceitfully destroyed our marriage. Fall was coming, and Gail was working harder to make me look bad. My efforts to gather wood were hampered by the growing cold. In order to warm up enough to dive on the logs, I had to take longer and longer stops. This resulted in Robert hauling more logs of pine and oak that he contracted with other logging companies for the milling operation, rather than as many of my timber. That, Gail claimed, supported calling off the collaboration. I couldn't help but notice the odd parallel between Stella's and Gail's attempts to disparage me. Naturally, I didn't see anything that would have justified their behavior, but I couldn't help but worry what I might have done to provoke them. I prayed in vain and had another lonely Saturday. I prayed to God on my way home, wondering whether I would ever feel whole again. I heard no response. My outcomes got worse over the course of a few more weeks. I mentioned to Robert that perhaps we should give up diving until springtime when I drove over to his house. As the outcomes kept going in Gail's favor, I could see her triumphant smile. Then she pulled off a complete ruse. She desired to use the boat tomorrow to examine potential spots along the Red River. Because of our success in the tributaries, we had postponed going on the Red River. Robert informed her that he couldn't make it since he had an earlier appointment in Houston. Gail was debating whether or not she could stand to be by myself on the pontoon boat, and I could see it show on her face. At last, she said that she was still up for going out. She ran past me in her maroon Texas A&M hoodie and jeans when I went to pick her up that morning and hopped into my truck. Robert had been jokingly telling me not to kill her as he prepared to depart. I simply took a few big breaths and headed to my pickup. We traveled to different locations along the river over the entire day. We would only talk when I told her I found a log by my bamboo pole or when she pointed me in another direction. My experience allowed me to identify when I was near timber. She would then input the location into her handheld GPS device. The depth of the river and the swift water were the two most alarming aspects I noted. While we looked for timber, I had to set down an extra anchor line to prevent the boat from drifting. Combining that with the masses of silt flowing through it would make diving in the murky water an exceedingly dangerous undertaking. Who knows what other difficulties I would encounter there. I would need to tie to anchor lines to prevent being swept downstream by the current. That meant diving equipment so I could descend for a sufficient amount of time to shape the winch lines around the logs. This was going to be a very risky venture. I would have to update my equipment and do a refresher course in scuba diving. It had been drilled into me for a very long time not to dive alone, thus I would also require a dive partner. I considered telling Gail about it as I kept watching her input data into her GPS. Then I had a realization. Gail never meant for me to jump into the trees we were surveying. She would persuade Robert by the following spring as to why I had outlived my usefulness and that it was necessary to replace an expensive partner with lower-paid staff. To ensure my dismissal, the new crew would begin work on the treasure I had assisted her in finding. I was so blinded by my wrath that I turned away from her and returned to the boat cockpit, afraid to look at her and her scheme of betrayal. What would have been a spectacular river sunset was turning from the late afternoon sun into the evening. I kept acting like I was doing some household job that didn't include looking at her. A loud splash and an unexpected quick shriek reached my ears. To my surprise, when I turned to face the boat's bow, I was unable to find Gail. At the same moment that I noticed something rushing down the river, I heard a shriek. The water was pushing Gail downstream, and she was swimming desperately upriver to the boat. I was sprinting the entire length of the boat by the time she let out a scream. She was 50 yards downstream and hidden by an undertow when I dove into the water. I knew that diving in after her was the appropriate move, even as I winced from the bone-chilling cold of the water. Had Gail been more sensible, she would have chosen to swim downstream to the bank, where she could have safely exited the water, rather than exerting herself to swim upstream. Rather, she was experiencing panic like many others would, and she wanted to get back to a place of safety. It was impossible for me to start the boat and raise the anchors in time to catch up to her. I had to make every effort to keep her in sight. I launched myself into a rapid downstream swim. Once more, I heard her shout, indicating that she had been freed by the undertow and had reached the surface. Even though I couldn't see, I knew she was making a valiant effort to reach me. She was rapidly becoming exhausted, which meant that either she would crash into an undertow from which she would be unable to emerge, or she would run into a snag and sustain injuries from which she would be helpless to rescue herself. I needed to reach her as soon as possible. When I got to where the undertow swept her under, I could feel it trying to pull me towards certain death. I was able to swiftly escape its hold since I was deliberately traveling at a fast pace. Her voice faltered and I gained ground, slowly, oh so slowly. I continued to cut through the water to get to her. An unidentified snag crashed into my torso mid-stroke. I gasped from the agony, sucked in the murky river water, and tried my best to spit it back out. I had to push past the ache and keep stroking Gail. She vanished again after 30 and 20 feet, but happily she reappeared. 10, 5, 15 feet. Before she gave up to nature's will, I noticed the last vestige of desperation on her face. 1, 2, 3. Her hands snatched away to clasp me as her arms flailed aimlessly toward me. I would now need to address a fresh threat of Gail inadvertently being attached to me and leading us both to our demise. I pulled on her hair, waiting for the ideal opportunity to reach out and grab it. The extra effort caused pain throughout my body because I was using the hand on my wounded side, but I persisted in holding on. Fortunately, Gail was grabbing my arm to stop me from pulling on her hair because of the pain I was causing her. We had a shot as long as she kept acting in that way. I got the odd feeling that, at last, I was touching the auburn tress's scarlet flames as I cautiously led us nearer to the bank. As we got closer to a sizable sandbar, I swiftly dispelled that idea. I persisted in my struggle to free us from the river's sway. My knee then struck some sand. I began to straighten up. Gail panicked again when I released her, trying to grab hold of me before she realized we were approaching ground. Crying, unable to breathe, and trembling from the cold, we both crept up the sandbar, tumbling into the damp sand in an attempt to get well. I experienced numbness in my fingers and toes along with sharp muscle spasms. I ignored Gail's pleading and crept up the bank. I gathered as many of the dry, brittle pine straws and oak leaves from the sandbar's peninsula as I could. I staggered back to Gail and, trying to keep it as out of the wind as possible, I took out my Zippo lighter in a last-ditch attempt to muster the will and agility enough to start a fire. We could clearly both be experiencing the onset of hypothermia. Our metabolism would shut down and we would both perish on that wretched little sandbar unless I could get warmth to us immediately. I fervently prayed as the lighter's wheel turned due to my thumb. Would it catch fire? Had the lighter fluid been tainted by the immersion? Would this be the last desperate thing I did? Would I see my kids again in the future? The vintage metal lighter's wheel revolved like the wheel of fate that decides our fate. I observed the initial sparks flying around before the feeble flame emerged in the October night. Holding it to the dry tinder and urging it to catch fire, I wept. The flame gradually made its way through the leaves, becoming brighter and stronger. As the flame grew and began to smoke, I added additional leaves for it to eat. I wished myself away so I might rush for more priceless leaves and straws. And after that, still another. As I made another dash to the bank, I urged Gail to take off her wet clothes. I now gathered little, dry twigs to add to the fire. I told Gail to toss them on the fire, but she didn't follow my instructions. Once more, I instructed her to strip as I returned with an armful of leaves in an attempt to get the fire to spread to the wood I had placed on top of it. The fire flickered briefly when I threw the leaves upon it. Before she went, I gave her a violent shake and urged her to change out of her drenched clothes. That woke her up, and I saw the resentment flare in her eyes once more. Good, I thought, the hate will keep you alive. While Gail was getting down on her knees and taking off the heavy, damp, and chilly sweater, I went to get some larger branches. I wish I could have savored that scene, but I was too busy switching between carrying wood and leaves to the fire. She was reaching for the snap on her jeans, and I saw that she had turned her back on me. Even yet, it was alluring to see her naked back as she battled her way out of the jeans' legs. By the time she made her next journey, her bra and underwear had accumulated on the heap of items, and she crouched down in front of the fire, feeling warm again. I now had enough of a stockpile to guarantee that it was secure for me to take off my clothes. Her silent sobs gradually developed into tears, which quickly became full-blown hysterics. I was unable to wait any longer. I approached her, sat down next to her, and gave her a hard squeeze. She cried into the icy night, and I held her still. Without the outer layer of civilization, we were just two primordial creatures attempting to survive in an indifferent and cruel world. I stroked her just to feel connected to her as she buried her head against mine, simply to let her know that she could count on my support. The blaze warmed us both and she accepted me even more. She stopped convulsing and started wailing, but she stayed in my arms. Subsequently, she directed her gaze towards me and mumbled, "Thank you." The magic spell was broken with that, and we started to feel uneasy. Both of us kept staring into the fire from our different stances. I said to her, "I'll get some wood so you can hang her clothes outside to dry," breaking the stillness. When I stood up, she looked away. I came back with some wood that would work, dropped it beside her, and said I was going deeper into the bank to get more. As she got ready, she saw this as my attempt to reassure her that I wouldn't pry into her personal space. After stepping away from the fire for as long as I could bear, I went back. She had, to my astonishment, also laid out my things to dry. Once more, we turned our backs on one another as I silently thanked her. If someone else had looked at it, it has to have looked hilarious. Even though we were both adults, alone in the world, and facing death, we couldn't get over the uneasy feeling that comes with just staring at each other. It appeared as though we both jointly agreed that we were not authorized to act in this manner, so we had to wait for our clothes to dry. We used to reach out and touch our clothes to measure their level of dryness in an exploratory manner. We would turn away from one another and hurry to get dressed as soon as the clothes eventually dried. The heavier clothes, the sweaters and jeans, had finally dried enough to wear. It was time for our conversation once we had both finally put on our clothes. "Gail, we need to make a decision. The obvious facts are as follows. We are stuck on the riverbank. Nobody knows about our situation, and we are unable to call for assistance because our phones are dead from the swim. Your grandfather is the only person who would be sad about us, and he won't return home until tomorrow. What would you like me to do, Gail? We have two options. Either we stay on the bank and hope a boat comes to save us, or Robert comes back and starts looking for us when he misses us." I paused and went on, "Or I could leave you here with enough firewood, walk through the woods back upstream and get the boat and come down and get you." She said outright that she wanted to return home as soon as possible. That was the response I had anticipated. Without considering the ramifications of their actions, everyone would have responded in the same way. Without light, I would have to make my way upstream along the riverbank, donning only tennis shoes as I maneuvered between the jagged, knobby roots that were just waiting to trip me, into the unknown undergrowth and briars that wait to ensnare me. It would be necessary for me to stagger into the chilly October evening and stutter forward until I reached our boat and encountered one final challenge. To save Gail, I would have to willingly jump back into the icy water, get back in the boat, crank it, and navigate through the bitter cold to the sandbar. To give Gail some time, I ventured into the woods one last time to collect firewood, pine that burns quickly, and oak that lasts longer. I instructed Gail to stay with the fire and keep it going if, for whatever reason, I was unable to return. There was a good probability that a boat would come to her aid when it got light. I informed her that I would trace the outline of the bank, meaning I should be visible to any possible rescuers. Gail launched herself at me in an impetuous hug as I started to walk away. God, I really wanted to stay there, shackled to her arms, but I had vowed to keep my word. As I turned to walk away from her, I found myself in unfamiliar territory as my eyes sought to acclimate to the darkness. I held my arms out in front of me, alerting me to any danger. I carefully walked around, avoiding the bristles and underbrush that were causing me pain. Frequently, I would encounter a dead end of unbreakable undergrowth and need to find a way past it in order to resume my path. I would frequently fall and hurt my ribs from hitting the unidentified object in the river. In the little moonlight, I could see where the river flowed beneath me, luring me back into its snare. I was so chilly that I lost all concept of time on my journey. How on earth had we made it this far down the swift-moving river? 100 yards, 5 kilometers. Extra. I started to lose hope after failing to locate the boat. I was motivated to keep going since I knew that Gail was worried and alone in the woods every single second. Finally, I came around a rise in the bank and saw it. A silent dark shadow floating down the river. As I walked to the last steps upstream that would guarantee that I would drift to the boat, I started mentally preparing myself for that cold I would have to suffer again. I willingly dove into the river for the second time that evening, mustering the last of my confidence before I finally realized what had happened. Once more, the bone-chilling cold made an appearance in my body. I was experiencing yet another relapse, and I could feel my body kicking in fast. I would not have had nearly as much time as I did to reply at first. I groped for the boat ladder on the starboard side of the pontoon, but the cold caused my fingers to cramp. I got on board somehow and quickly turned on the engine. I leaped to the toolbox and felt around for the flashlight and knife that were among the things kept there, and the reliable mercury outboard started up. I proceeded to each anchor line and cut through them swiftly after turning on the light, and then we were adrift. Afraid that I wouldn't go aground or encounter any hidden hazards, I dashed to the cockpit, engaged the navigation lights, and pushed the throttle ahead at top speed. My body temperature was getting dangerously near to zero due to the wind chill, and I could feel the approaching freeze working against me. I squinted, scanning the darkness for indications of the flame. There, that pinprick of orange. Is it possible? I perceived a human figure dancing and attempting to gesture at me. I killed the engine and the throttle, allowing the boat's momentum to bring it to a rest on the beach. Gail's warm greetings abruptly ceased when she saw my state. When she finally realized what I had gone through, she hurried to help me get as close to the fire as possible. She flung every fragment of wood over the flames, igniting a broad berth surrounding the sandbar. She then undressed me, sobbing as she saw the bruises and scrapes all over my body and cursing me at the same time. I curled myself into a fetal posture near the fire, and fortunately, I fell asleep while still hearing her call me a stupid. I was still in the fetal position, the fire was still raging, there was a fresh supply of wood available. My clothing were once more drying off from the heat of the fire, and Gail was standing behind me, pressing her body up against my back to provide body heat. When I asked her blearily how long I had been gone, she said it didn't matter. All I needed to do was sleep and be warm. We stayed there on the ground, and out of all the positions I had imagined having with Gail ever since I met her, this was one I had never considered. She started apologizing to me in great detail. She never would have asked me to do that if she had simply considered what I needed to do. Nobody put a pistol to my head to make me tell her to stop talking. We stood there till I noticed my garments smoking and steaming from the heat. Gail stood up quickly, adjusted the clothing to finish drying, and returned to her original position. I started to believe that I could grow to love this job. She eventually stood up and indicated that my clothing were dry, at which point she moved into the woods to give me the freedom to get dressed on my own. At that moment, I started the boat and she came back into sight. I tell Gail to assist me in dousing the fire with sand despite the fact that there was a sizable barrier of sand between it and any flammable item. As the final dying ember of the previously present life-sustaining fire vanished from view, I experienced a slight sense of melancholy. Gail moved ahead of me and partially sat, then stood at the captain's chair in the cockpit while I shifted the boat into reverse and activated the navigation lights once more. As we headed toward the marina where we had launched early that morning, I realized that we would be exchanging body heat for some time. Gail would hide behind me until she felt comfortable enough to come back to the front when she grew cold from protecting me. I crossed the channel and reached the marina's harbor as it emerged on the other side of the river. I was not in the right condition to load the boat onto the trailer and move it outside. I discovered a vacant slip, tied the boat off, and turned off the motor. It was late at night and the marina was empty. If someone felt offended, they could get in touch with Robert, who would then get in touch with me by calling the Coast Guard, who would run the registration number. We hobbled up to my truck, which I started and quickly cranked up to maximum temperature. As we started the last few kilometers to Gail's house, I noticed a broad smile of thanks on her face. We hadn't talked much since the marina, and the heat was starting to wear me out. To keep myself awake, I asked her to get to chatting. Then, for the first time, I just listened to that gentle, melodic voice without the sharp, bitter venom I was accustomed to. We reached her house, the kilometers going by too swiftly for once. As I came to a stop in her driveway, I felt conflicted. Contentment that, after such a terrifying ordeal, I had managed to bring her home. I was saddened by her departure, knowing that our little truce would likely be broken the next day and we would resume our own little Cold War. Fear that I would pass out in my trailer after driving for 20 more minutes. It was likely that I might nod off while operating a vehicle. As she left, I assumed she was saying goodnight to me. Rather, she turned to face the house and stated, "Don't even think you are going anywhere." I obediently followed her, getting out of the truck and heading towards the home. She gave me the order to start a fire in their fireplace as soon as I entered. She entered the kitchen and said, "I know you can do that. I've seen you in action." As I was getting ready to light the fire, I heard clattering. My Zippo lighter would not light when I tried to use it. I struck one of the long-stemmed matches Robert had used to start the fire, thinking about how well our lives were balanced. I used Robert's tinderbox in the fireplace, and within minutes the flames were happily licking up to begin feeding on the seasoned oak. Gail emerged with 2 large ceramic cups that were scorching hot. After placing the mugs on the coffee table, she walked to the hallway closet and took out some warm woolen blankets, saying, "I'm afraid I can only offer you chicken noodle soup out of the Canute. Next time I promise you it will be homemade." "I should sit down on the couch," she said. I hesitated, staring at my bleeding, grimy, sand-gritted garments. She put a blanket around me and offered me one of the mugs, and I understood for the first time that she was using my name. "Oh, for God's sakes, John, it's just a couch. I'll get it cleaned." I complied once more. She then covered herself with the second blanket and took a slow sip from her soup mug. After she turned down the lights with the remote, we sat side by side in the darkened den, enjoying our soup and gazing into the fire. She did the same as I put my empty mug back on the coffee table. We kept staring into the fire, and as the log's embers heated and cooled at different times, I was enthralled by the ocean of changing orange tones. It brought to mind Gail's hair. The golden flames persisted in consuming the logs. Gail rolled over and rested her head on my shoulder. When she did speak, it was after a long time in that same state. She started, gazing directly into the fire, speaking softly and timidly. "I'm going to tell you a story. I don't want you to interrupt. I don't want you to stop me. I don't want you to say anything until I've finished," she said. She went on, "About 2 months before I graduated, I met this guy from school and started dating him. He looked a lot like you, tall, brown hair, cute smile, green eyes. I was getting real attached to him, but I still wanted to make sure he was the one. So I kept stalling him whenever he started talking about taking it to the next level. He made the noise of saying he understood, but still he kept pushing and pushing at me." Before continuing, Gail paused and slid her hand on my bicep, which was covered in a blanket, for support. We went out to an expensive restaurant to celebrate our graduation that evening. I excused myself to use the restroom, and when I returned to the table, a pricey bottle of wine had been uncorked. He said that only the best would do, raised his wine flute, and made a toast, saying, "To us, may we always be happy." I finished my wine flute, gave him a dazzling smile, and looked forward to what lay ahead for me. My roommates found me splayed out on the living room floor when they got home, and 6 hours later I was being driven to the hospital by ambulance. When they couldn't get me to wake up, they dialed 911, and when the police and ambulance came at roughly the same time, they ordered a toxicology screen, which revealed I had been using date drugs. Gail's revelation as she dug deeper into the pain stunned me. The investigator assigned to my case persisted in requesting the identity of the offender. I was protecting him, and he knew it. It appears that running away, hiding, and acting as though nothing happened or that they were to blame is not that uncommon for women. The detective advised me to phone him if I wanted to change my mind and cooperate. After returning home, I wore my brand of shame for the first time. My scarlet letter would be my maroon Texas A&M shirt, a memory of my relationship with my perpetrator. I would get a little bit deader every day and display my humiliation for all to see. However, you must realize that they were blind. All they could make out was a woman wearing a college emblem on her shirt. It was my shield as well, my defense against the realization that I had been discarded and handled like meat. As she continued to pierce further into her wounded psyche and draw out the emotional pus, I wanted her to stop. I wanted her to never have to go through the horror again. As she went on, her palm was clutching my bicep in agony. I retreated from my friends, one by one, as they all insisted that I should go to counseling, call the police, do this, or do that. Even so, I was able to sink farther into my misery. Wearing that awful brand every day and detesting myself every day, I resolved to keep pulling back. I asked to stay with my grandfather over the phone. Naturally, he said yes, so I descended and took in the breathtaking scenery, letting go of some of my guilt. He showed me the Red River once more, and the inspiration for it came from a history lecture I heard a long time ago. I started researching it because I felt that by dedicating myself to this endeavor, I may lessen my embarrassment a little bit. My grandfather then proposed that you be included. I was cool with meeting you because I knew we would need assistance to make this work, but not so much when I saw who you reminded me. I had to put up with the everyday pain of seeing you and wearing that emblem every day. I was trying every day to figure out how to make you unnecessary and unimportant so you would leave and stop bothering me. I suppose I would still be looking for a way to get rid of you if I hadn't tripped over my own damn foot and fallen overboard," she said, raising the volume of her voice as she finished her sentence. "Oh God, I was so afraid and alone and cold ... that numbing cold as I tried to swim back to the boat and saw you diving in," she sobbed once again as she recalled the incident. "After being drugged by something underwater, I surfaced, gasping for breath, and tried to reach out to you, but it felt like I was moving away from you. As soon as you grabbed my hair, everything blurred. The anguish forced me to grab your hand in order for you to release my hair, even though I wanted to hold onto you so you could save me. After that, you shoved me onto the sandbar, and the cold air rendered me immobile. I could only observe while you constructed the fire, and my sense of warmth gradually returned. I was going to defy you when you asked me to take off my clothing because I was having another flashback. Subsequently, you screamed at me, and I knew that if I didn't undress, you would rip them off. You then pressured me, and I realized I had no choice but to sit there helpless. I sat huddled, ready for you to take over and mistreat me. Then, as you drew near and started stripping, you sat down and eventually started to warm up. Every second restored my faith in my ability to get through, and then I experienced a stroke of serendipity when I recognized you for who you truly were, not some monster from my past. You came over to me when I started crying because I was embarrassed of what I had put upon you." Once more, Gail broke down into sobs uncontrollably. I was able to free my arm from the blanket and wrap it around her, offering her solace and a wordless embrace while the fire burned out. I felt her stirring when I woke up, and we both noticed an incredulous Robert staring down at us. I wouldn't believe this if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. "Can someone tell me what the hell our boat is doing in the marina? And why wouldn't either of you answer your phones?" After untangling, Gail and I awkwardly got to our feet. Gail gave me a hopeful glance. I understood her request. "You have to tell him. I'm going to go get our boat and I'll come right back and then we will decide what to do." Gail and Robert were heading to the kitchen table to share all the secrets with him as I was leaving. With an apology and a $100 donation, which included having the personnel lift the boat onto my trailer, I was able to appease the marina's unhappy owner. Robert was still seated at the kitchen table, looking pale and attempting to process what had happened. When I returned to his place, he informed me that Gail was having a shower when I inquired where she was. When Gail came in front of us, we began talking about things from our point of view. "No," I yelled, "you are through paying a penance you don't owe. Get upstairs and put anything else on but that." When Gail saw that I was still wearing her badge of shame and her college logo, she was taken aback. I considered that to be resolved. She cautiously descended while sporting a pretty blouse that complemented her appearance. She grinned and hurried to give me a hug when I opened my arms in response. My ribs hurt like crazy. Subsequently, she turned to face Robert, who embraced her with a long embrace. Subsequently, he demanded to take us to the hospital for further examination. My ribs were bandaged tightly to heal and had sustained serious bruises. Numerous wounds were cleansed, and prescriptions for everything from medicines to antiseptics were written down. Fortunately, Gail did not sustain any more physical ailments beyond exposure. We decided to go to College Station by car the following day. Accompanied by us, Gail entered the police station and provided a detailed statement to the designated detective, identifying the offender. The story was told in full to Gail's roommates when we next visited with them. They all hurried to express their friend's love and affection. I was held too, and I realized that the intensity of these women's hugs would require me to take extra medicine. Gail inquired whether her friends knew of a therapist who practiced close to her grandfather. In an attempt to locate her that information, 10 phones appeared at once. I was given permission to use the front passenger seat for comfort as Robert had to drive. Gail kept huddled over me, asking me questions while we were driving. Upon returning to Robert's residence, she insisted that I take up residence in the extra guest room. She remarked that my living in that tiny trailer alone, without someone to take care of me, was not acceptable. I was really excited for her to say something similar to my grandmother. When they first met, of course, they got along just well. Since I was still on the pills and had no business driving, Gail offered to take me to the visitation. Having someone to chat to throughout the dreaded hour of waiting and the trip was a wonderful change of pace. Even after I stopped using painkillers in November, Gail expressed her want to accompany me. Once more, she provided a much-needed diversion from my suffering. After the unsuccessful visit in December, she assisted me in reloading the gifts into my truck. On the off chance that the products would materialize, I had bought them. To help a family in need, Gail proposed donating the gifts to a charitable organization. For Gail, things were going well. Her assailant was taken into custody, and a warrant requiring his DNA was served. The match was perfect. A second warrant was obtained to examine his phone. On his phone, he had captured the entire repulsive behavior on video. Rather than wait to petition for a speedy trial, he and his lawyer had made up their minds. The rationale is that Gail would be more likely to back down from testifying now than if she had a year to prepare, considering her early resistance to cooperate. She entered the witness stand composedly and gave a detailed account of the terror she experienced. In less than an hour, the jury returned and handed down the harshest punishment possible for each crime. The bailiff informed me that although they would have returned sooner, they were attempting to extend their time to give him more than was permitted. The connection progressed at a pleasant pace. I made it clear that I would do whatever it took to support Gail when I was invited to take part in some of her sessions. I had the therapist's word that Gail knew that already. So the months went by, and by the time we returned to the Red River in late spring, Gail and I had recovered the data that we had initially lost. I made sure she spent the whole journey wearing a life jacket. She refused to tell me what was in the big crates Robert had carried onto the boat's stern. She told me she had changed her mind and wanted to visit our sandbar as we got closer to the dangerous location where she had fallen back in October. We landed there after I obeyed, and she got off and asked if I could make her a fire. I quickly started a fire in the same location as before after going to get some old wood and pulling out my reconditioned Zippo lighter. She then requested that I begin removing the contents from the boxes. I set up a tent first, so I went over to where we had gathered and started building it. Next to it was an electrically powered air mattress blower. It quickly filled with air once I plugged it into the boat's power converter. I tucked it into the tent with the two-person sleeping bag. It was not your usual campfire cuisine. Snacks, hot dogs, marshmallows, Coke, and water bottles. And in the ice cooler, a bottle of champagne is getting cold. A familiarity that had eluded us both the previous fall. We talked and communicated as we sat side by side, enjoying the simple pleasure of our outing. I extended my arm and ran a delicate palm through her stunning red curls. She pointed out that the first time I'd done it on the sandbar, I'd been much harder with her. I apologized to her and asked how I could make things right. She gave me permission to kiss her. I leaned close to give her a gentle kiss. She insisted on another one, and another, and another, as I gradually pulled away from the kiss. We started examining each other's bodies with our hands, and I relished the feeling of her cooing under my kisses. When she was ready, she undressed and tossed the t-shirt in the general vicinity of where the clothing had dried, and I noticed her big bosom jiggling. That caused a cascade of clothing to be discarded and piled on top of one another. Recognizing my utilitarian need for comfort, I unfolded the large picnic blanket onto the sand and took a seat next to the most stunning creature I had ever laid eyes on. Her perfect alabaster complexion, her sapphire-like deep blue eyes, and her beautiful, full lips that demand to be kissed. Hell, I could have kissed her whole body. And I did, starting at her head and working my way down to her toes. Naturally, certain topics received more attention than others. However, I reasoned that everything will balance out in 40 or 50 years. I soon focused all of my concentration on a certain location that I intended to mine for riches. I moved closer to her, kissing all around, until I was kissing her right in the eyes, and we slipped back into the silence of the night. When I got up early in the morning, a sea of light gray clouds covered us in a thick layer of fog. I kissed my sweetheart gently as I gazed at her sweetly sleeping. Before opening her eyes and giving me another kiss, she went through a series of actions with a slight smile on her face. She stood up, spreading her arms wide and clinging to the blanket like a proud mother of the soil, showing off her finery to the world. We were still confined to our little drab universe, and the world was just me. I observed her stroll towards the sandbar's edge and the secure water eddy next to the bank. She cautiously entered the water and submerged more of her body into the motionless surface as she continued to get used to it. I had taken out the iron skillet and set it back over the fire I had kindled. I quickly had rashers of bacon ready by pulling them from the griddle and cooking eggs in their place. I saw a goddess of nature approach me, and I immediately felt hungry for something different. She must have realized the food was ready because she carefully strolled out of the lake to me. She put her hand on my cheek and assured me that she would feed me. We would eat first, though. After she kept her word, we walked hand in hand into the water and gave each other a gentle bath. As the fog started to clear and we were bathed in warm, radiant sunlight, we agreed and started getting dressed. Everything that we never used, including the air mattress, sleeping bag, and tent, was packed by me. As we drove back to our launch ramp, I thought, well, that would be a good excuse for another trip. Everything was going well until my ex-wife, Stella, began sending me uninvited texts. As I already stated, I disregarded everything since I was determined not to give her any leverage over me. At last, my divorce lawyer called to tell me that Stella wanted to talk to me about a potential proposal. He gave me his word that we would not be breaking any active court orders by meeting her in his office. Gail told me that I might as well find out what Stella wanted to talk about when I requested her opinion. That's the reason I ended myself in my lawyer's conference room when Stella entered through the open door. She had not had a pleasant few years. I had heard that Ted had gotten her pregnant with twins after their marriage. Given the extra weight on her frame, the bags under her eyes, and the frown lines on her forehead, I assumed that raising 4 kids was a bit too much for Stella. Stella asked me how I was doing as she sat down. I thought, fuck this. I wasn't going to talk to her pointlessly. What the hell do you want, Stella? I asked, staring at her icily. She lost her equilibrium and began to stutter out her reason for being there. She was speaking in her own tongue, which I found incomprehensible, so I ordered her to stop or I would go. How would you like to have the children? She asked with her eyes closed. I cautiously inquired, okay, Stella, what's the catch? There is no catch, John. If you want to have the children, I will have custody awarded to you and I will have visitation. All right, Stella, replied I. You better explain to me why you are doing this at this stage of the game. Look, do you want the children or not? She shot back. Listen, before I decide to do this, you are going to answer some questions. First, I don't care why you divorced me, but why did you go nuclear on me telling all those lies about hurting you and the kids? She exhaled. That day you almost caught us, embarrassed Ted. All he could think about was you telling the whole city how he ran off from you. He decided that to take me and the children away from you would be your just desserts. Then it wasn't good enough. Ted wanted more revenge, so I placed that call to have you meet me when you got arrested. That placated him for a little while. Then he decided to turn the children against you by buying them everything under the sun and grant all their wishes. Presto, Ted had an instant family and you were left with nothing. Okay, Stella, now the real reason why you want to give me custody. Stella appeared as though she would cry. When I got pregnant with the twins, Ted shifted his affection from Carol and Stephen to his kids. I kept begging him to continue to love them, but he started seeing his raising your children was a form of cuckolding him, and he resented it. Stella started to sniff and glanced at the tissue box next to me. I told her to get up and get a tissue if she wanted one. I kept waiting. Stephen and Carol both reacted badly to Ted's rejection. All they knew was they used to get everything, and now their half-brothers are being spoiled with Ted's time and money. Stephen is running with a bad crowd and Carol is claiming she has a 22-year-old boyfriend. If you don't take them, John, they are going to be totally lost. I made an effort to picture my 15-year-old son Stephen as a juvenile offender, followed by my 13-year-old daughter Carol, who had an adult partner. I reflected on how lovely they had been as kids. What on earth had become of them? I was aware of the response. They had been used as a prize in the divorce game, and after Stella and Ted had prevailed, they had diverted their focus, leaving Stephen and Carol perplexed. And in a frantic want for love, the children were lash out for attention. Stella, why now? You've kept them from me for 5 years. Why the big change of heart? With a stare at the ground, she declared, I'm pregnant again. Oh, doesn't that beat them all? She was doing an amazing job transitioning back into the role of pregnant, barefoot woman who used to moan about me wanting to keep her in the kitchen. She looked away from me when I asked when she wanted the custody change to become effective, but she answered right away, immediately. At that moment, I realized she would never pay Stephen or Carol a single visit. She was going to desert them, the way she had deserted me. I was so repulsed by this beast that I was no longer even able to recognize. My desire was to depart, have a shower, and then simply spend the remainder of the day cuddled up in Gail's arms. We talked about the last-minute details of transferring custody through mutual agreement. Upon completion, we both got up from the table. Stella paused, as if she thought I would approach and give her a hug. She held out her hand to shake mine when I didn't. I just kept staring at her till she let go of my hand and left through the door. The mutual decree to switch custody was approved by the court with no issues. The fact that the accused child abuser now held custody was not brought up. A conversation happened at the location of my visits. I saw 2 gloomy children carry their luggage full of stuff inside the room. What a crime, I thought to myself, to have robbed 5 years of watching my kids grow up. When I went to give them a hug, neither of them appeared really excited about it. It dawned on me that I would also need to get past Stella and Ted's 5 years of continuous criticism of me. It would take time to heal this. Stephen took a cigarette out of a pack and lighted it as I packed their bags into the car. I grabbed it from his mouth with my outstretched hand and pressed it beneath my foot. When you are an adult, you can smoke all you want, but right now you are living under my rules. He scoffed at me as I forced him to give me the pack and threw them aside. Carol exclaimed, I thought Mom was evil, when she found herself getting licked over my laps before realizing what was going on. Get this straight, you two, you will respect your mother at all times in front of me. Carol was shocked to be disciplined for the first time in 5 years when I finally let her stand up. Meekly, she and Stephen climbed into the truck, not knowing quite what to expect. I informed them they would be meeting someone extremely special in my life when we got home. That also didn't appear to impress them too much. I continued attempting to maintain a conversation on the return journey. All I received was sarcasm or a heavy silence. A phone rang during one of the long pauses, and Carol picked it up and put it on speakerphone. With the way he continued to talk to Carol and make nasty remarks and recommendations, I soon realized that this was the 22-year-old lover. I grabbed the phone as she brought it a bit too close to me and threw it out the window. When Carol glanced around, she witnessed it bounce 3 or 4 times before an 18-wheeler flattened it. She yelled at me, threatening to purchase a new phone. I questioned her about whose strategy and with whose money. That made her stop talking. When we arrived at my grandparents', I could see that the children were struggling to embrace their great-grandparents' unconditional love. Grandma never stopped telling them about all the good times the kids had when they were little and came to the farm. Carol grinned suddenly and added, the ducks. That's right, the ducks, you kept calling them your babies and you had names for them all. Grinned Grandma, turning to face my son. And you, Stephen, you would hop up to go fishing as soon as you got here till it was time to leave. Grandma grinned back. Seeing an opening, I asked the kids if they wanted to go on the pontoon boat the following day while I looked for wood. Lots of chances to fish or observe the wild ducks, as I mentioned. I could see how difficult and drawn out this would be from the dejected expressions on their faces when they both said no. Stephen said that it might be time to pack up his and Carol's possessions because it was becoming late. He said, "Where is your trailer?" assuming that he and Carol would be sharing the rickety little trailer with me. I'm afraid I'll have to disappoint you, Stephen. I bought the old Andrews place and I live in that house now. Gail is there fixing up the rooms for y'all right now. I clarified. Granny and Grandpa are coming over for dinner and you're going to meet Robert Lambert, Gail's grandfather, who is also my business partner. How about we start that way? I tried to ignore Stephen's rudeness, but all I heard on the way to my house were sarcastic remarks about this Gail person as he brought her up. So, you boinking her? With a sneer. You remember Carol's lesson earlier when she disrespected your mother. I glared at him as I drove on. Do you have the same goal in mind? I stated coldly, both of you better understand right now, Gail is just as worthy of respect as your mother is and I will not tolerate any rudeness to her. Because if you are, I can accommodate you right here and now on the side of the road. When the massive ranch with its accompanying acreage came into view, Carol and Stephen were taken aback by its size and started to get excited about the large backyard pool and the horses wandering around the fields. However, they quickly realized they were supposed to be aloof, disgruntled teenagers and went back to being quiet. As Stephen entered my home carrying his bags, I had never seen a teenager so ready to despise someone so completely. I also had never witnessed a more rapid change of heart when Gail appeared, grinned, and hugged him. "Hey Stephen, it's great to finally meet you." I couldn't criticize him for that, though, as it instantly occurred to me that he was in love with Gail. I thought he was going to melt. Gail turned to Carol and showed her the same love and care before showing them to their rooms, which were large and roomy and furnished with TVs, stereos, computers, and private bathrooms. Gail explained that the wood used for the furniture was black walnut that we had dredged up in our business operation, and that an artisan had negotiated the building of the furniture in exchange for several logs for his own use. Gail had another surprise for Carol. Carol had always wanted a dog, but Stella had never entertained the idea. There was a Labrador retriever puppy with a red bow on its bed, and as soon as Carol entered the room and saw the eager animal trying to get to her, she ran to it and scooped it up as the puppy started licking her face. That was when the kids realized why we were performing our operation and also how I could afford this large house. "Oh my gosh, who is this girl?" Carol asked with excitement. "Well, honey, it is your puppy, so you get to name her," I replied. That won me and Gail a big hug, and she started giggling with Stephen about names, settling on Pepper after consulting with him, and licking Carol's face and wagging her little tail furiously. While Gail and Carol were talking about crate training the puppy, I called Stephen outside to come with me to the big shop building next to the barn. It was a 1964 Ford Mustang that needed restoration, and I told Stephen that I hoped we could work together to bring the car back to glory as I opened the large overhead door. Stephen just stared there, struggling to reconcile his feelings of hate and love for me, so I left him to study his car. Gail knew what was going on and continued to treat Stephen with polite deference instead of mockery while we all enjoyed the backyard barbecue. Carol was listening to Grandpa explain how to make Pepper obey commands. Stephen was hovering around Gail, listening carefully to her every word and kept trying to impress her. I noticed a hard grimace on Stephen's face as we left the room, but it answered a lot of questions when everyone left and Gail and I said an early goodnight to Carol and Stephen before heading to our room. The next day, we spent enrolling them in their new school, and that evening, I started asking them about their day. They didn't realize that I used to do this, but I insisted on knowing what my children learned each day and that being gone for 5 years would not be an excuse. Every night, they had to be ready to tell me what was going on, and we would talk about their lessons. I also informed them that I had already joined the Parents Teachers Association and would be meeting with all of their teachers shortly to see what I could do to guarantee that they received a good education. After dinner, I asked Stephen if he wanted to start working on his car, but he swiftly replied no, which I had to attribute to his unfulfilled desires for Gail. I brought it up to her in bed, and she stated that she was working on a plan, which I hoped would work. Time passed, I would celebrate my small successes and lament my small setbacks with my kids, and then something finally tipped the scales. It was time to begin baling hay from the fields to feed the cattle, and I continued to use a small baler that produced rectangular bales, about 50 to 60 pounds in weight, as opposed to the big round bales that are popular across the nation. The issue was that since the bales needed to be put in the barn, they would need to be loaded into my grandfather's flatbed trailer, driven to the barn, and then unloaded. I recruited Stephen to assist me. Together, we would load and unload the bales while my grandfather drove the truck through the field to each bale. However, I did not account for the fact that he would raid my beer stash the night before and would wake up hungover. I simply dragged him to the trailer and instructed my grandfather to head out into the field. In the heat of the day, I made him pull in the heavy, scratchy bales in spite of all his complaints, and he soon got sick and threw up the remnants of the alcohol he'd consumed, telling me he could not do this anymore. I broke one of my main rules when I gave him a bottle of water to stay hydrated. "So, you going to give up on me, Stephen? Are you going to give up on me the way your mother gave up on you?" I got off the trailer and strolled over to the nearest bale, which I hauled toward the trailer without waiting for a response. For the remainder of the day, Stephen worked like a man possessed, carrying 3 bales to every job I completed. When the last bale was in the barn, he turned to me, hot, sweaty, and covered in dust, and he snarled, "Screw you," as he made his way inside to have a shower. He was still giving me the stare that night as we waited for Gail to come outside so we could start grilling steaks. Stephen and I were poised on a precipice and I had no idea how we were going to survive. They stopped in front of Stephen and Gail said, "Hey Stephen, I want you to meet my niece, Betty." I was surprised to see a younger version of Gail when she arrived with groceries and a passenger who was similarly loaded with sacks. She recently moved back here with her family, and Stephen was staring at Betty fixatedly. I could tell that the longing he had for Gail had now shifted to the gorgeous adolescent. "Would you please assist me with carrying these sacks, Stephen?" I could only shake my head at the miracle Gail had made as the 3 of them headed toward the house before Betty could finish her query and Stephen got up to go to her and relieve her of her burden. Throughout the entire grill out, Stephen and Betty were totally absorbed in each other's company. When Stephen asked her what she had planned for the upcoming weekend, she replied that her father needed to bale hay, so she would be busy. Stephen offered to help right away, and I told Betty she couldn't find a better worker than Stephen. Stephen turned to face me, appreciative of my comment. "Oh Stephen, it sounds wonderful. Given your size and strength, we could definitely use your assistance, and it won't take long to complete the task." She gave him a heartfelt hug, and I couldn't help but think, damn, he really had it bad for her. Terry's men were kryptonite to Lambert's ladies, and I knew that I was no better when I noticed Gail staring at me. They talked some more, and then Betty asked to see Stephen's Mustang and asked to ride with him when he had it fixed, which I knew was all the motivation Stephen would need to want to restore his car. I held Carol back while they went to look at the car. I told Gail she was brilliant later that night in bed, and she insisted I thank her. Things with Stephen became easier after Betty entered his life. In an attempt to win Betty over, Stephen changed into the son I knew was buried beneath the hurt and rejection. For Carol, though, it was a different story. She would not give up on her 22-year-old boyfriend, no matter how much I tried to explain that since she was only 13, nature physically rejected that age difference, and that it would not matter later in life when she matured. But right now it was against the law and morality. Carol wrote to him every chance she got, and Stephen had granted access to his phone until Betty begged him to cease pushing such an unsettling relationship, so my throwing her phone did not end the correspondence. We argued about it for a while until one day there was a knock on my door and that sorry guy announced he was going to run away with Carol and start their lives. I knew this was a planned move because Carol came out of her room carrying a suitcase. I told him to get off my property and not to get in touch with Carol until she turned 18. Stephen had caught them trying to sneak out of the house and started fighting with him. Carol was adamant that she was going with him until Stephen talked some sense into her. I thought we had survived that impasse until late that night when I was woken up by a loud commotion. I ran into Carol's room in time to see her boyfriend hitting Stephen, knocking him down. The boyfriend was bleeding profusely, had 2 black eyes, a broken nose, and I was about to poke his gonads into his tonsils for the 3rd time when the deputies came. After everything calmed down, the sheriff showed Carol some pornographic videos that had been discovered on a laptop in the creep's car, which startled her into reality and her desire to grow up too quickly. Her creep boyfriend ended up spending the next 20 years in Huntsville as the romantic partner of a Crips gangbanger. The last turning point came when Carol and Stephen started to miss their mother and requested if they might spend Christmas break with her. I said I didn't mind and they excitedly contacted to arrange to meet her. I requested Gail and Betty to come with us, feeling uneasy about what was going to happen, and we were told that the transfer would take place at our regular visiting spot along with the day and time of our meeting. When we arrived at the location with plenty of time to spare, Stephen and Carol were excited to see their mother, and he was talking about how he was going to miss Betty for a full week and how he was going to make it up to her. The kids' excitement gradually faded as time went on, and Stephen began attempting, but failing, to call his mother on his cell phone. 2 hours later, they asked me to drive by the house so they could be let out, and I grudgingly agreed. When we got to the unremarkable suburban house, Stephen and Carol looked so vulnerable and alone as they walked up the steps. They rang the doorbell, and a moment later, a startled Stella answered and stepped outside, closing the door behind her. The body language, the animated movements, and the anxiety conveyed what was going on, even if I couldn't hear the discussion. Having hoped that the visitation idea would be quickly forgotten in the rush of the holidays, Stella decided to ignore Stephen's calls. She never imagined the kids would be able to persuade me to drive them to her house. Now that she was in the situation where she had to confront her children, she had to tell them they were not welcome while Carol ran back to the truck in tears, needing to be consoled by Gail. All I could do was begin the agonizing trip back home as Stephen walked slowly back to the truck and stoically got in, his body starting to shake from the silent cries. Betty wrapped him in her arms. Nobody spoke until we were about 20 miles from home, and it was getting dark inside the vehicle with only the instrument panel and the occasional beam of light from passing traffic for lighting. You felt like you did. You felt just like this when you came to visit and we weren't there. Every time we were too busy to spend time with you. We used to shatter your heart every month, but you continued going back to have it shattered again. A fresh cry emerged from the back as Carol comprehended after all this time what I had suffered. Gail held her while my son's quiet, hardly controlled voice contained his grief. 1,000 comments in my throat and the hurt kept me silent for my response. Gail and Betty walked into the kitchen after we arrived home so I could speak with my children. I am unable to alter the past. All I can do is savor the moment and anticipate what is ahead. My 2 amazing children are a blessing from God, and all I want is for them to lead happy lives. I do not want them to remain mired in the past over unchangeable circumstances. As a family, I want to be able to share in their happiness, and I want them to be happy. I will always be happy if I can have that. After my speech was over, the 3 of us hugged each other until Gail and Betty joined us. And that's when the healing started. Life went on, and our family kept growing. Gail, Carol, and I sat with my grandparents and the entire Lambert family as a solid block of support for Stephen and Betty tonight at their high school graduation. I felt great pleasure as Betty and Stephen walked up to earn their diploma, trying to ignore all the cheers coming from our section. From the corner of my eye, I saw her approaching Stephen after they had to pose for all the required pictures, and, at last, we offered them mercy so they could join their classmates in a night of celebration. She gave him a hug, and he gave it to her without showing any enthusiasm. She asked a stranger to take a picture of her and her son, and when the stranger did, Stephen slipped out of sight. She looked up, complaining that the picture was out of focus and that she wanted a second chance. She was disappointed to learn that there would be no second chances tonight. Her children with Ted continued to cause problems at home and at school, and I suspected she had a long list of do-overs. Ted Jefferson had continued his philandering lifestyle until he met up with a gold digger who drained him financially. By the time the succubus had finished with him, he had lost his money, his businesses, and his home. He had tried to confront her, and the boyfriend had put him in the hospital. He had to file for bankruptcy, and now he and Stella were desperate to make ends meet. Stella turned and walked away, vanishing in the crowd. Her entire life shattered, and all she had left was an out-of-focus photo with her kid. The emotional anguish and humiliation drove her to embark on an eating binge, and now she was genuinely porcine proportions. We were celebrating Stephen and Betty's graduation in our own special way, and I was gasping as my sweaty body pressed against Gail's. I heard Gail ask, "How was that?" As I kept trying to regain my breath, I exclaimed, "That was awful." After I mocked her, Gail slipped on top of me and slyly scraped my chest with her fingernails, continuing her attack until I told her to give up. "Have you thought about the farm owned by the Thompsons?" Gail inquired about a potential purchase that we had been considering. "Yeah, I think we could run cattle on the acreage, but I'd have to see about getting some tags and clearing out all those alligators on that lake. Otherwise, they'd decimate a herd. Oh my gosh, we could take the alligator hides and have belts, purses, and boots made for Betty and Carol, myself, and my girlfriends as Christmas presents." I tried to imagine Gail wearing only cowboy boots. What a presentation that would be for Santa. She also raised her delicate foot in the air, striking numerous positions. "Talking about Carol, where did she disappear to this evening?" "Well, honey, she wanted to spend some time with Tommy Douglas and she is sweet on him. He is scheduled to visit you tomorrow to request permission to accompany Carol on a date." "Is that Tommy Douglas, the boy of Dr. Douglas?" "Yes, sweetheart, don't frighten him away, he's already anxious about asking you." Gail gave the command. "How come he would be afraid of me?" I questioned, perplexed. "Well, it might be that you have a reputation for intimidating males who try to abduct your daughter," Gail replied dryly. Though I shuddered to think of what had happened to Gail, I could only see that as a positive thing that would help ensure my daughter would be safe enough to make her own decisions on that. I didn't want that to happen to her or any other woman. "I promise you and Carol I'll be on my best behavior." When Gail turned out the light, it struck me that there were a lot of different kinds of fortunes. For example, you could be rich in gold or any other precious material, but what use would that have in the end? Randy Masner's voice said, "You can spend all your time making money, you can spend all your love making time." It struck me as a sad attempt to push that idea to its absolute limit. I was a wealthy man indeed, but the one thing I ever found worth pushing to the limit was my children living under my roof and securely nestled in my arms in my bed. "Darling, could we do that horrible thing one more time tonight?" Gail whispered in my ear. I started to push it to the edge, and she licked my ear. My comment: "Good start on payback on Stella and Ted, but it was a little of a sideways payback. Something more direct such as lawsuits for child support and anything he could have done. What do you think about the ending? Comment down below."